This is Jordan Poyer, safety for the Buffalo Bills, and you are now listening to Cover One Buffalo Podcast. Let's go.
Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo Podcast. You are joining your normal host, Greg Thompson, along with our special guest. Many of you know from the Lockdown Bills podcast, and you should know from the Draft Network and the Draft Dudes podcast. It is your time of year to shine, my man. Joe Marino, how we doing?
Greg, thanks for having me on, man. I've always enjoyed talking ball with you. I've asked you for plenty of spots with me on Locked On Bills, so it's nice to hop on with you and get a chance to chat with you and your audience here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, you just got back and you've been, I love when people share a little bit more than just the ball side of things on their shows. And I share some things about my travels and work. And I think it's been awesome you sharing a little of your experience as a new father. And I know that had to be tough being away for a whole week for the first time with that little princess back at home. How was it like getting back in that first moment?
Man, well, okay, so obviously I could not wait to get back. She was 6 weeks old, and then I had to leave for an entire week. And that was tough. And we had great support from our family and stuff like that. So my wife wasn't just, trying to figure it out without support. So that was great that we had so many people willing to help. But coming back, all I wanted to do was hold her. But it's right in the thick of this coronavirus deal, right? And so I had a terrible travel arrangement coming back. I had to go from Indy to Detroit and then Detroit to Charlotte. So I'm in 3 different airports. Quite a long layover getting back. And so I'm like, I need to clean up before I even think about touching this baby. So I didn't get home until after midnight on Tuesday and jumped in the shower, got cleaned up, and then enjoyed being back with my little girl. So obviously I love the combine, but usually when I leave and go out on the road for a week, whether it's Senior Bowl, Shrine Game, Combine in the past, that's not what I'm leaving behind. So this was definitely a different experience.
Yeah, no, it's funny. And I certainly got that down in Mobile where you could tell there were some guys that that was their first time away from their wife and kids in quite a while and maybe overindulged a little bit. But it was awesome to be able to see that many people. And I know, I couldn't believe, every time I'm turning my head, it's Frank Reich is over here and oh, wow, that's Dan Quinn. And you're just, every single guy is, crazy. You're watching Charlie Casserly sitting there with his arm. I can't imagine with how Indy is. It's that times 10 where you literally have every GM, every head coach, except for Belichick, who goes and watches D3 people in the rain. And seeing that around there, how does that balance for a guy like you, where obviously your wheelhouse is the prospects and watching the players and wanting to see the drills and wanting to see that? How hard is it for you to balance wanting to do the networking side of things and wanting to talk to the front office people versus wanting tunnel vision on the players on the field?
It's tough to balance. I think the good news is I've done this for 5 years now where I've been on the road and going to these events. And I remember the first time I stepped into what is it in the Shrine or Senior Bowl, that the hotel where everyone's at?
Oh yeah.
Whatever it's called. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. And I walked in there to go pick up my credential. And the first thing I saw was Spencer Drango, who was an offensive tackle prospect from Baylor. And he was talking to Todd Bowles. And I'm like, oh, this is how this is going to be. And you get up the escalator and, everybody's there. And then our first practice for the Senior Bowl was, you got out onto the field at this high school that they used to have at least one practice at. And I stepped onto the field, and I kid you not, Dan Marino is the first guy that I look at, and I'm like, oh, okay. And then I kind of walk away from that situation, and I wanted to watch some of the receivers that year, and Dabo Swinney's standing right there watching receivers. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to get over this because I need to focus on what's happening here. So I'm fortunate in that I've had some time now where I've gotten through that a little bit, and it's somewhat common to see these types of people, but it does become a balancing act where you have to identify your purpose of being at the combine. And there are people that are insiders and really want to go there for the scoops and the nuggets. And I'm not going to say that I don't enjoy that piece of it and that I do pick up some things, and I'm very intentional about the people that I know and the people that I will speak to. But yeah, for me, it's about evaluation. I get a rare opportunity where 300 plus prospects are available to me. And I don't always get a chance to talk to all of these guys. And so try to be very specific with my opportunities to get to podium sessions or on the breakout sessions, or if guys are in the hallway speaking to a prospect as opposed to, a scout for the Cleveland Browns, something along those lines. So it's about identifying your purpose, trying to stay focused within that. And then the reality is you have those opportunities to network as well, especially with the format this year where it was a little bit more spread out. You had the workouts in the evening. You had the podium sessions in the morning. You had some big gaps there where you could really take opportunities to go and talk to people. I had lunch with an NFL offensive line coach one day. A lot of that stuff was very valuable. And I believe I had the opportunity to do that because of the way things were structured. I know a lot of people are really upset with how things went this year in terms of where the timing of the events in prime time and stuff like that. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it gave me more flexibility and opportunities to tap into both of those niches of covering the combine.
Yeah, I saw a couple different proposals that I think would be smart. I think they can maximize more content of what they showed. It turned into basically the entire coverage was just the 40. That was it. Like you saw almost nothing else. And I think they underestimate how much, people, if we're willing to watch guys run 40 yards, we're probably willing to watch them jump and wiggle around too on the other thing. So I think there's some opportunity there for the broadcast, but yeah, it's interesting hearing that feedback. And I had the same experience. I was pretty good at watching the position coaches in the Senior Bowl and getting a jump start on when they were going to start drills. And I'm watching the offensive line coach. I see that he's heading down this way. Okay, they're going to start the drills and getting a head start. And I posted up in a really good spot down to the end zone for the D-line drills. And all of a sudden on my right shoulder, like literally touching my jacket, is Dave Gettleman. And then the other side is Charles Robinson. And they're having a conversation and kind of engaging me in the conversation about watching, oh man, Bradley and he carries that weight well. He's pretty thick. And I'm like, yeah, he is. It's just so funny to try to like play it cool and be like, yeah, this is totally normal. This is just a regular thing that normal people do. So yeah, I was still very much in that first experience for there, and hopefully we'll be a little bit more used to it. And
we need to get you down to Shrine Week next year. That's really where everyone's on the field, and so you get that same interaction like you were talking about with Dave Gettleman and Charles Robinson or whoever's down there, but you're also 5-10 feet away from the drill on the field, so you can actually listen to what that coach is saying to the players and really interpret how they respond to that instruction. And so, man, Senior Bowl is great. It's a better showcase of talent, but for those types of nuggets, you can't beat the Shrine game.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put it on the list. So I think one of the things I think you can really help a lot of fans, and specifically Bills fans, because there's certainly positions we'll get to here in a moment, but help understand for someone who does the number of evaluations that you do, the level of detail that you go into. I know people always try to balance out that, hey, we know the majority is the film and what you see and understanding the capabilities and skill set of the prospect. But then you always hear these things about, skyrocketing up boards and terms that get thrown around. And that, obviously you now have Chase Claypool as wide receiver 1, I assume, after his performance, and just try to help fans understand let's use Chase Claypool as an example where you have a guy. What does that open up and what does that do for someone like you? Do you go back and look at a game again? Do you go back and say, I wonder if that's going to get someone there? I temper fans and guys in our Slack channel all the time that, hey, Al Davis isn't around anymore. Aren't people who are just automatically drafting the fastest 40 in the draft way too high. I said, it's a piece of the puzzle, but in my interpretation, it's 10%. Someone like you who puts in the time and effort that you do, how do you weigh in a performance at the combine that maybe didn't match what you saw on film?
Well, I think that was something that I wrestled with for a very long time. I started covering the NFL draft in 2011 in terms of in a published capacity, and I made draft boards, I made mock drafts, all that type of stuff. And I always wrestled with my process because it was watch a player, try to get all the data, and then you just stack them up the way you feel, right? That guy looks like a first rounder to me. That guy looks like a fourth rounder. Oh, wow, he was much faster than I anticipated. Now he's a third rounder. And so I really hated how subjective that was. And scouting is to an extent subjective, but I tried to create a process where I put every single prospect through the same criteria. And that way I was consistent in how I applied all of the information to the evaluation. So the way that I evaluate prospects is I have 4 categories: film, production, size, and athleticism. And for every single prospect, and it's different by position because I weigh them differently.
Sure.
For every single position, at least 85% of the evaluation is film. Some prospects or some positions, it's 90%. And then I'll take the other three categories. Those will be production, athleticism, and size. And it's all numerically scored, and that it ranges from 5 to 7% per category. And so within those items, let's say it's 5%, the combine testing is 5%. That means of that 5%, a certain percentage is the 40-yard dash, the 10-yard split, the 3-cone, the 20-yard short shuttle, the broad, all the different components of it based on historical data in terms of that position and what normal is, and then what's good and bad. And it's all stacked up in this numerical system that has weighted values to every single component. That way the same information is applied exactly the same to every single player at every single position. And so what I think that does is it creates consistency. And I'm looking at every single prospect exactly the same, and I'm not having biases towards players, and I'm not counting things twice. You know, like I can watch the tape on Chase Claypool, and I'll get a feel for his play speed, and he'll be graded accordingly there. But then when the 40-yard dash comes around, it's a different conversation because whatever he is relative to that position is what he is. And so for me, it took a long time. I started this system in 2017. I've tweaked it a bit since then, but I think the key for me has been finding a way to quantify every component of the evaluation, be consistent in how the information is applied, and then you get those scores and you stack your board, and it creates less bias and it creates consistency. And that's really what I'm looking for. And you just naturally have those biases when you watch players, but when you take everything and quantify it, it really kind of diminishes that, and it makes it true and consistent for every single player.
Yeah, I think that really helps a lot in understanding that, you know, there may be some questions about, okay, was there a difference in usage? Did they have the opportunity to display that trait to that level? I can see a few anomalies or exceptions where you go back and ask, like, wow, that was a surprising performance time jump, whatever it might be. I didn't expect that. And then you go back and look and be like, I didn't have it noted that they couldn't do that, but I never really saw it displayed that way. So maybe I'm open to there being an opportunity there, but I think that's pretty rare. And I think that when fans see, you know, and obviously you guys have built a fantastic mechanism on the Draft Network, and people love the mock draft machine. And I think they get tied to those values. And all of a sudden to be like, oh, well, I saw Chase Claypool going in the 5th and 6th round consistently, and he just had a performance where someone put a tweet up on Twitter that said, hey, anyone who was over 6'4" and over 235 pounds and ran under a 4.45, it was Kelvin Johnson and Chase Claypool. He must jump to the first round now because that's a historic performance. And that I don't think it's nothing. I do think that when you have, and our next topic is tiers of talent, I do think when you have as deep of a wide receiver class as what you do, and you get into, hey, maybe he was at the bottom end of the third tier, and maybe now people are a little more open to, I wonder if we could use that size and speed a little bit more. Maybe it's a tiebreaker that pushes him up towards the top of that third tier. I don't think that's crazy. And that, hey, he would have been a later 4th round pick, and maybe now somebody is worried, hey, he might not be there. We might need to take him in our late 3rd round pick. Maybe that comes into play, but people don't leap 3 and 4 rounds after a combine performance like some people on Twitter like to make it out to be.
Not if you've evaluated their tape. Now, if you're not familiar with the player and you just watch games and you've, because you've watched games, you've seen players, but never really with the scouting lens, then you're going to be all over the place with your takes. But if you've done the work, if you've assessed the film with a critical eye to write your final report, not that much is going to change. I mean, I don't want to sound like I've got it all figured out, because, man, I don't. I got a lot to learn, and I try to ask a lot of questions, and I have mentors and people that I talk to all the time. But I mean, you when you get to the combine and you've studied these guys, there's not a whole lot of new information unless you just straight up interpreted the tape wrong, which could happen. But I think if you've done the thorough work that you should do beforehand, if you're in this field, you're not going to be that surprised by some of the stuff you see on the combine.
Yeah, the variance kills me. So my best example is I was the guy who was very early on Kyle Duggar, and that I had a little bit of a sniff that the Bills were interested, and that, hey, there's a kid down there that is off the radar that could be exciting. And I'm seeing him in the mock drafts, and people are saying, hey, I snuck Kyle Duggar in the 6th round. And I'm like, yeah, he's not going to be there. I don't know what to tell you, but he's not going to be a late day 3 pick. And now all of a sudden I'm the opposite, where now people are like, man, the Bills might need to take him at 22. And I'm like,
right.
He's not a first round pick. Like, he didn't all of a sudden, like, I've always thought he was a late 2nd, early 3rd round guy. He's the 50th to 75th. And then if we can get lucky at 86, that's a great value. If we feel like we need to take him at 54, it's not crazy, but that he didn't all of a sudden launch up there. And I've gone from warning people that no, he's not nearly going to go that late, to now warning people, well, no, he's not going to go that early, and trying to find that happy medium. The variance of people discovering prospects kills me.
Yeah, never speak in absolute terms with the NFL draft. It's just never smart. I mean, I have a lot of content that's draft related. I have a lot of tweets that are draft related, and I can't believe how many times people respond with things like, that will never happen. That there's no chance that'll ever happen. And I actually, last year, I started to save some of those receipts.
Yeah.
Because it's totally ridiculous. One of them was that A.J. Brown would never last to pick 53. One of them was that the New York Giants would never take a defensive back in the 1st round. One of them, I mean, I can go all day long, and you just look silly, because the NFL draft is one of the most unpredictable things, and there's so much variance. There's 32 teams. There's 32 completely different draft boards. There's things that everyone values differently. And so the best thing you can do is be open-minded with the NFL draft. And I mean, the reality is it's an inexact science. These are human beings we're talking about. I could feel wonderful about a player's tape, but there's variables that I just don't know about that will affect their success. And so, you try to form good opinions. You try to put all that you can into it. You try to have a good process, but at the end of the day, it's just about trying to be as close to correct as you can, but there's always variables that you can't account for. And, that's why I think I care so much more about your process, what you say about prospects, a whole lot more than where you have a guy in your top 100.
Yeah, I always say, as soon as people go with those absolutes, I always say, go and find me someone who had Cleveland Farrell going 5 picks ahead of Ed Oliver, and then we can talk. Yeah. Like, it just, you don't know. Hey, did you have, DK Metcalf going 64th last year? That's usually my response. And
sure.
It's just, we don't know. Like, we put in all this time and effort, and then crazy stuff happens. It's just, there's a range. I think that good people can be within 80% of the time. Like, hey, most of the players are going to go in this ballpark, but crazy stuff happens. And I think that takes us to our next area here. You've spoken about it in that, the most science shows that more darts is better to throw at the dartboard, and that Brandon Beane has not been in that mechanism. And I think that obviously all of us do what we're good at, and if we're successful, it reinforces it. And that's just human nature. If you're good at something and you find success, you're going to assume that doing that again in the future is going to work well. So people all of a sudden thinking that Brandon Beane's going to turn into this guy who trades down multiple times, I think is a little wishful thinking. I don't think it's crazy. He could show that he's capable of doing it because he hasn't done it once. But I think it's more important to look at why we've seen trade-ups happen in 6 times in the last 3 drafts. And for me, it's looking at talent tiers. And that if you go and look at the linebackers who were drafted after Tremaine Edmonds, the tackles who were drafted after Cody Ford, the tight ends who were drafted after Dawson Knox, there was a pretty definitive tier that they were scrambling, saying, hey, there's not going to be any good ones left. We better get one. And it wasn't necessarily that particular guy. Like, I don't know that Dawson Knox was the guy, but I think he was in one of those 3 or 4 in that tier that, hey, we got to get one of them. And if we don't, it's not going to matter. And then he was the last one left. So they pounced to do that. And I think it could help Bills fans see a little bit in some of the key positions where you see some of those drop-offs where let's start with wide receiver, in that I think a lot of people perceive it to be a top 3 that are pretty defined and then a very ambiguous range of a second tier. How do you see those groups and where there's a more defined drop-off in your grading system?
Well, I think it's just to kind of go back to some of the points you made about Brandon Beane and having lots of darts. I think he likes to have a lot of darts going into it. Yeah. And then he wants to be pretty selective with the darts from there. And another thing that kind of complicates interpreting Beane and his philosophies with the draft is that we know these guys in terms of McDermott and Beane, they're very particular about the human beings that they're going to bring into their building. And so when we talk about depth at a position group, it's not as deep for them, right? Because there's just guys that are not going to be on their board because they don't like the way they're wired. They don't think they have the right DNA. They're not going to be good fits for the culture. And so we might think that there's 10 wide receivers that are worth a day one or second round pick. That list for the Bills could be 6, right? Just because they don't like a human being. And so I caution people when we talk about the depth of a class, it's more shallow when it comes to the Bills because they're particular. So when it does come to wide receivers, this is probably something people have heard me say a lot. I think there's 3 guys that I would pound the table for and say, go get that guy in the first round. The 2 Alabama receivers, Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs, and then, of course, CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma. Those are the guys I'm interested in the first round because I feel like that next tier, I can get very comparable players in the second round. I would understand if a team took Justin Jefferson from LSU in the first round. I'd understand if Jalen Reagor from TCU was in the first round. Denzel Mims from Baylor was a first-round pick. All of that makes sense to me, but I just don't know that there's that big of a drop-off when I think about the second-round options. So for me, at wide receiver, I want one of those 3 guys, or I want to wait.
And I think that makes a ton of sense with where you've seen, let's use the Tremaine Edmonds trade, that all of a sudden we're sitting in that same range, that 21-22 range. If you see one of those 3 fall to that 15, 16, 17, and all of a sudden we could get up there with our third-round pick and not having to use a second-rounder, I think that's where you see it really fall. And another position that I think is weirdly flipped in the last couple weeks, where Bills fans went from offensive tackle being completely off the radar to now all of a sudden there's this great acceptance that maybe we drafted offensive tackle. Do you see it as a defined top 4, or do you think that names like Jones and Jackson are in that same tier? I see it as a pretty defined top 4.
Yeah, it's those top 4. Becton from Louisville, Jedrick Wills, Alabama, Tristan Wirfs, Iowa, and then Andrew Thomas, Georgia.
Yep.
Those are the 4 dudes, man. If you can get one of them, you're in good shape. That's a plug-and-play starter. If you don't get one of them, you have some really talented guys that I think can be starters, but it's a big drop-off. And I like some of those next tier. You mentioned Jones and Jackson. I like Lucas Nang from TCU. I like Matt Pert from UConn, good football player. But, yeah, I'm willing to wait on those guys. And the thing about it is, like, there eventually math becomes on your side because only so many players can go, right? There's 21 players that are going to come off the board before the Bills. And so eventually at one of these position groups, if things go a certain way, you're going to get a guy to fall to you or get into that range where it's only going to cost you that 3rd round pick to potentially move up 3-4 spots. So at offensive tackle, specifically for the Bills, give me one of those top 4, or it's a hard pass for me in terms of waiting to 54 or even in the 3rd round.
I like that a lot, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's an interesting spot at defensive end, and I think that's one where you had the opposite of the Chase Claypool effect at the Combine, where obviously Chase Young is not anywhere in our discussion. There's no scenario where we're going to trade up high enough or where he's going to drop far enough, regardless of how delightful that would be to plug in a player like that. Then you all of a sudden get into what seems to be kind of a flavor of the month thing. You have almost polar opposite prospects of AJ Epinesa and Clavon Chason, where one has the twitchy upside but not as much production. Other has every off the field box checked, but all of a sudden now, after what people had pretty low expectations going into the Combine, he went under those low expectations and tested even lesser than what they expected. And then, does Yetur Gross-Matos get into that discussion? Does, there's some different guys from Boise State, from other areas that, hey, do you get into Zack Bond in that discussion? Where do you see the more defined drop-offs? Obviously, I think Chase Young is in a class by himself. Do you then have it a next 1, a next 2, a next 5? Like how big do you see that next tier of defensive end?
Yeah, so Chase Young, he's going to be one of the best pass rushers in the league. The Bills are never bad enough to get a player like that, right? You got to win 6 games, right?
That tweet that just came out where they showed the last time every team took the number 1 overall
Bruce
pick.
Smith, right?
And it's great. Our pick is Bruce Smith, and the Browns have had 6 of those since then. And that we just never we were never bad enough. We were always too mediocre.
Yeah, 6-10, 7-9. You get Leotis McKelvin instead of Patrick Peterson, right?
Yeah.
That's just what happens.
Oh, that's depressing.
So not sure if that's the same draft, but it sounded good in my head.
Yeah, I liked it. Okay,
good. Thanks. All right, so we got Chase Young, top of the board, drop off. Caleb Chase on, I think, 10 to 15 range. He's from LSU. I love his ability to do a lot of different things. He can play in space. I think he can cover, but burst and bend in terms of pass rush ability is really exciting. And then it really comes down to this next tier, I think, where you have Yetur Gross-Matos from Penn State, player that I'd be interested at 22. I would want to know who else is available or who you could potentially move up a little bit for. But I like Yetur Gross-Matos. I think he's a good scheme fit for what the Bills like to do. I really like Zack Bond. I think that he's close to that Yetur Gross-Matos tier, except for with Bond, I think you have to look at him more as a true hybrid player, not a guy that's going to play every down on the edge. And that's probably okay, given how the Bills were able to use Lorenzo Alexander in the past, right? 10 to 15 snaps a game as a Sam linebacker, and then still playing 25, 30% of the snaps as a rush player, whether that's inside or outside. And I think Zack Bond can do that for you. And my goodness, like, you want to talk DNA process guy, McDermott's going to love him. I don't know if they're going to take him at 22. I wouldn't hate it. Ideally, you can maybe move back a little bit and get a Zack Bond, but I mean, a process guy through and through that is worth at least mentioning in that discussion. Then there's a drop off, and I do want to talk about AJ Epinesa. I get a ton of questions about him. That's probably because I talked him up a bit in terms of him being an option if the Bills were to go defensive end at 22. The challenge here is that his athletic testing confirmed that he's not going to be a scheme fit. I don't think he's a bad prospect. I think he's a good player. I think he'll have a good NFL career. I think he could be a Trey Flowers type defensive end. Yeah. And that's still a 4-3, but there's different styles of 4-3, right? Like, you think about the Patriots, Dolphins, Lions, they like to run this compression style defense where they don't have a whole lot of guys with burst and bend, but what they do have is long arm guys, heavy handed guys that can really compress the pocket, stay in their rush lanes, and really fold things around that quarterback. And then you kind of send the guy through a gap and you get pressure. The Bills aren't that style of defense. They're a 4-3 where your defensive ends need to be able to win around the outside hip of the offensive tackle. And when you have the type of physical limitations now that we know AJ Epinesa has, you just don't see him as a fit in that role. And so there's a role for Epinesa to be a good player. Trey Flowers just got paid like $18 million a season.
Yeah.
Like, in Epinesa, I would argue, is a more physically gifted player than Trey Flowers. So he's a good player, just not for the Bills defense. If you want to use him as a 5-tech, sure. Play him in a 3-4. He can play 5-tech, really use his extension skills to play the run and, be able to use his inside pass rush ability a little bit more. Sure. Not in the Bills style of 4-3. And so I'd be surprised if he was on the radar, to be completely honest with you, if they were to draft him. I think Beane has earned our trust at this point, and I can tell you lots of good things about Epinesa that will inspire the belief that he can be a productive player. I just don't see him as a fit. And then, like you started to talk about, Greg, this is the flavor of the month type deal. There's 5-7 guys that I could see realistically going in the second round, but what are you looking for? They're sort of incomplete players. Now, there's some dynamic guys that I think can be good pass rushers. I like Josh Uch from Michigan. I think he can be a hybrid type player, and he hasn't gotten a ton of opportunities, but my goodness, every chance he gets, he's really effective. I wouldn't mind him in the second round. Darrell Taylor, you lose some explosion there, but you get some power at the point. To your point, it's a lot of variety, and it's really difficult to guess exactly who the Bills would want if they were to wait until day 2. And intriguing options, but a lot of different types of players.
Yeah, I've been intrigued by Bradley and I've been intrigued by Jabari Zuniga. There's been a couple people that have stood out that, check the box of, obviously, the Bills show an archetype of the measurements that they like to see, and that there's guys that all of a sudden when you start seeing that, I've compared Epinesa at one point to, hey, wouldn't it be nice if Shaq Lawson was 6'6" instead of 6'2", and that, that's kind of the player he is. I don't know that I see them wanting him if they were to re-sign Shaq. I think the guys like Chason and Zack Bond are perfect if we re-sign Shaq, where they can kind of play that the Lorenzo Alexander role on first and second down, and then almost replace Shaq on third down and be able to stay on the field pivoting back and forth from a strong side linebacker and then a pass rush role. Whereas if you get Epinet, then all of a sudden he's the guy you almost have to replace on third and long, or hope he can kick in to defensive tackle in some kind of format. So it's limiting, and I think you laid it out perfectly. He still might be worth the 22nd overall pick for the right team and in the right scheme. You just doubt that scheme or team is the Bills.
No, you're not going to change what you do for Epinesa. I don't think so.
Yeah, correct. That's what. Yeah, that's what I mean. And the final position that I think is probably the least, not popular, but the least assumed, where I think it is very much in play at 22, is cornerback. And that, it depends on what we see with Kevin Johnson, and that I think you threw out some numbers that make sense in one of your most recent shows. I had projected him at 2 years, $11 million, 5.5 is kind of a respectful bump that, hey, you made $3 million last year. You stayed healthy for every game for the first time. We respect that. And I think he's a great pairing with Levi Wallace, where you have a good depth third guy either way. If they do that, that takes some pressure off, but I don't think it eliminates the opportunity with some of the talent that's here. And whether you get into, whether you prefer CJ Henderson, or whether you prefer Jeff Gladney, or whether you prefer Trayvon Diggs. Obviously, I don't see any chance we get into the Jeff Okudah range. But where do you see that next tier? And do you see a guy that's a scheme fit that would make sense? Let's say we get to where those top 4 tackles are gone, the top 3 receivers are gone, Chason and anyone in that tier are gone, and all of a sudden it's, hey, do we roll the dice that we couldn't get whoever's left of Rager, Ayuk, Jefferson, Mims, one of those guys in the second round are moving up a little bit? Should we pounce on a elite talent at a premier position, and that fans won't be excited about it, but a name they might see at cornerback?
Yeah, cornerback's a fascinating discussion. First things first, it's an extremely valuable position in the NFL. I mean, it's their good cornerback play is directly tied to winning football games in this league. And the Bills have an elite corner in Trey White. He's going to cost a lot of money. 18, 19, maybe 20 million for this guy, depending on when he signs. If I'm the Bills, I want to get that deal done as soon as possible, because it's going to be more expensive next year. And that may be, Trey, if he may want to wait. And I think Beane actually, he was on WGR, I think, this past week, and he kind of alluded to the fact that, the timing has to make sense for both parties, and they can see the value in getting the deal done now, right? Bird in hand's better than 2 in the bush. Certainly the Bills know it's going to be cheaper now, and Trey White, doesn't want to have something bad happen this season where that's going to push down his value. But, he's going to get paid more if he waits till next season and he's healthy. So there's that variable to come into play. But with that type of money being set for Trey, you can't pay another guy that type of money on the opposite side. And it's an important position. That's kind of a point I've been trying to make a lot here lately, is that the Bills are going to need to invest early picks in cornerbacks so that way they have talented options opposite of Trey White. I think we learned a lot about the physical restrictions of Levi Wallace this past year. A smart football player, but one that has size and athletic restrictions that make him a liability, especially for a guy that's going to be targeted so much playing opposite of Trey White, because the quarterback doesn't want to target Trey White. So cornerback is a need, ladies and gentlemen. Get familiar with that. With something that needs to be addressed. And so in the first round, I can get behind it for sure. You mentioned Okudah. Forget about that. I think CJ Henderson from Florida is going to be top 12 pick. He's a man coverage guy. And the reason I want to talk about man coverage guys a little bit, because the Bills their zone defense. And so the most valuable type of cornerbacks are the ones that have man coverage skills. That's the ones that people pay a premium for. The Bills can get away with the zone type cornerbacks. And there's some zone guys that I like on day 2. If you didn't want to go in the first round and get one of these guys. But if they were to go in the first round with a corner, Christian Fulton from LSU, I'm a big fan of his game. Actually, at the Combine, he talked up his relationship with Trey White. Fulton was a freshman when Trey White was a senior at LSU, and really spoke to how he observed Trey White and gained a lot of respect for him and his habits and how he worked and how he prepared. And they've stayed closely connected. I know all of the LSU DBs stay closely connected. And so I think you have a natural pairing there if the Bills are able to scoop him up in the first round. really good technically. He's a true technician in coverage. I think he can play man. He's really good in press, and he's got tremendous awareness, which shows up in zone coverage. Always calm. I mean, just always calm. The ball's in the air. He never panics. Even when he's going up against a guy like Henry Ruggs, who has world-class speed, just his ability to be patient and mirror and not get panicky and stay in phase. I mean, I think he's a great player. Like, I think he's a top 15 talent in this class. So if he were the pick at 22, I would love that. Really like Jeff Gladney from TCU. He gives you that man coverage ability, but he's got the type of instincts and physicality and range that when he's queuing on the quarterback in a zone type role, I can see him having success. And you do have some more versatility if you were to bring him in, because he does have man coverage ability. So those are kind of the guys that I'm interested in the first round. But day two, there's guys I like. Bryce Hall from Virginia. Been talking that dude up for a couple years now.
Yeah, process guy that he's right there.
Absolutely. You've got Michael Ojemudia from Iowa. If you're looking for a third round cornerback option, Troy Pride from Notre Dame. He's got all the man coverage instincts, but his ball skills are really, really poor. So if you get him more in a zone role where his eyes are in the backfield instead of back to the ball so frequently, I think you can really take advantage of what he does bring to the table, which is elite quickness, fluid hips, and really like his competitive nature is something I really appreciate. Damon Arnett from Ohio State really profiles well, actually beautifully, to his own type role. So, I get excited. The thing about corner for me, I recognize the value of the position, but I also recognize that I feel like in all of the first three rounds, I can get guys that I like. Yeah. And it's a position where you really can trust McDermott, Leslie Frazier to maximize the talent within that player, because they've had a long resume of getting production out of cornerbacks taken at all various points in the draft. So as much as I can get behind a first round corner, I believe in the depth of this class, and I believe in this coaching staff to really, really develop these guys. So I guess I'm really open-minded when it comes to cornerbacks, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's smart, and I think it shows the logic of, I don't think it's going to be the reason that you take obviously it's not going to be the reason that you take a definitively better player, right, or a lesser player over someone at 22. But all of a sudden, if they look and like, hey, somehow both Andrew Thomas and Christian Fulton made it to pick 22.
Andrew Thomas.
But that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And let's say the Bills had them graded completely equally. Yep. And that just in their scheme, they're equal. But you look at yourself and say, hey, this is the last of the four tackles. And then there's a big drop off. But we still think we could get whoever in the second round. And I absolutely think that comes into play when you're talking about Rager, Jefferson, Ayuk, Higgins, whoever you happen to like at the top of that second tier receiver. It's going to be really tough to convince yourself that, are we going to be mad when it gets to pick 54 and Denzel Mims was still there, but we reached on Jefferson at 22?
Yeah.
And that, hey, we could have just sat there and stumbled into Denzel Mims anyways. I think that those kind of tiebreakers do come into play when you look at the talent tiers, and that I don't expect them to trade up unless it's, in my mind, it's Chazon makes it to 19.
Sure.
Wirfs makes it to 18. Ruggs, or for some reason, God awful reason, CD Lamb starts to fall, I would be ecstatic.
He's going 8 to the Cardinals. There's your nugget right there. Going to the Cardinals.
Ruined things for me. No, but one of those guys starts to fall. I think we could see that. But beyond there, I think that the fallback plan makes a little bit more sense that, hey, we may end up, and you get into that tiebreaker kind of discussion.
I'm with you. I think you have a really good approach to this, Greg, in terms of the types of talents that I would move up for. And then thinking about the opposite of that, where there's so many players that I feel comfortable with at all of the positions of need for the Bills, that it's almost like get some more picks, right? Whether that's maybe moving back a little bit in the first round, or it's taking some of those day 3 picks, right? The Bills have 6 day 3 picks right now. Package a couple of those, get back into the third round, and get yourself another dart to throw at a player. I mean, I wouldn't hate double dipping at wide receiver in the top 3 rounds with if you have 4 picks, especially. Like I said, the cornerback options I think are really, really exciting in terms of guys that can help the Bills. And if you wanted to get one of those reasonably exciting offensive tackle prospects that you feel like can be a starter at right tackle that gives you the opportunity to move Cody Ford to guard, then that's valuable too. So the way that this draft stacks up for the Bills and their needs as we know them today, that's another thing I keep saying.
Oh, yeah.
Free agency is coming, right? Brandon Beane is going to change the landscape of the needs by the time we get to whatever it is, April 23rd. So as we see it right now, I just really like how this draft stacks up to strengthen where the Bills need help.
Yeah, ideally, I'd love to see a scenario where, let's say those couple tiers happen and that you see CJ Henderson, you see Christian Fulton, you see Jeff Gladney all go. You see the top 3 receivers all go. You see the top 4 tackles all go. You see Chazon, and maybe even one other surprise that would go. And all of a sudden, you're left with, oh, wow, all of our top elite guys there. That's where I do think that there's a scenario we could see Beane's first trade down, and then maybe it's not all the way out of the first, maybe it's the 29, 30, 31, or a couple of those teams who have the 2 early seconds where you could see that, and maybe even pick up ammo where you trade down a little bit, but then you also say, hey, Denzel Mims is on the board at 43. We don't think he's going to make it to 54, but we'll slide up a little bit for him. Bryce Hall is on the board at 72. We don't think he's going to make it to 86, but he's worth bumping up a little bit there. And you end up jumping up a couple times later on because you see that drop off in that talent tier happen at the back end where you listed all the names you're excited about. You get to the tail end of that tier and you move up a little bit to snag one of them. I'd love to see, multiple jockeying back and forth where we end up with more condensed between pick 30 and pick 90 than having 22, but then later on picks.
And also I think it's important to mention the dynamics of every single offseason that Brandon Beane's had to navigate through have been really different, each and every one of them. And so while we think we know who Brandon Beane is as a GM, especially in the draft, this is a dynamic that we haven't seen before, right? Like early on, it was we need foundational players for the roster because there's nobody with superstar potential. And then it was, holy crap, we need to get an NFL caliber roster and get rid of all this dead cap space and go aggressive in free agency and still try to get some of those foundational players. And now it's like, okay, nothing is that critical. The Bills need to get better. The roster needs to get better. There's areas that needs to improve, but that was a really good team that we watched play football last year, and a lot of it's coming back. And there's just a lot of flexibility. And so we've never seen him with this opportunity to come in where you feel as good as you ever have about the roster. You have a lot of cap space. You have 9 draft picks. So I'm not really sure that we can speak in absolutes in terms of who Brandon Beane is and what he's always going to do. I think he will always go get his guys, but that could look differently. Like you said, it could be a trade back and then a move up.
Yeah.
So let's keep an open mind when it comes to Brandon Beane. Even though he said some things in pressers this year and he's been pretty candid, I think, who knows, right? Like he said that we're not going to be major players in free agency. We're a draft and develop team. And I've heard that echoed by other people, but I'm not willing to say that I've got the guy figured out yet after, really, I guess 3 off seasons.
Absolutely. All of a sudden, I don't think we see multiple splurge moves, but I think we could see one reasonable signing. If that guy happens to be Robert Quinn, if it happens to be Brian Bulaga, if it happens to be, I don't think it's going to be a Xavier Rhodes or a corner, but all of a sudden, if it's Kyle Van Noy, all of a sudden that shifts to be, we signed Kyle Van Noy, we might not now have as high of a priority on Zack Bond, right, because that's the role that we're envisioning. So all it takes is one reasonably significant signing. I think there's plenty of times where, obviously signing Rashard Higgins doesn't change the fact of whether we draft a receiver or not, but there is a pocket where I can see that impacting that, hey, we're probably not going to sign a $10 million right tackle and draft a guy at 22. It's probably not going to be both. It will change dramatically. And I think at this point last year, going into the draft, I think all of us had offensive line significantly higher, and he went out and signed 7 of them. So, we just don't know what it's going to be a month from now after we see some of these signings happen. One final topic, as you know, I think you spoke to it really well in a recent show about what some people perceive as competitiveness in the Bills podcasting world is much more camaraderie and interaction than what people realize. And that I think there's a healthy level of competition of pushing people to raise their game, listening to things like, oh man, I wish I had a thought of that. I don't think there's as much, kind of bitterness or petty things back and forth. I think we all talk a lot more than people would realize. One thing that I am a very loyal listener to Locked On Bills, there's a topic that I think philosophically we're a little bit different on, and you speak about it in the it came up in your T. Higgins evaluation, and it came up in maybe players who have a specific skill set, maybe a limited skill set, that they're only really good at that thing, and that in that particular one, it's the downfield accuracy, and that we haven't seen that from Josh Allen. So therefore, that may be a wasted pick, and that may be an area that we're not going to be able to maximize what he's best at. So, we would want to go another direction and lean into where he showed exceptional accuracy in the intermediate. Let's get a guy who separates there and maximizes that skill. And in my mindset, it has been, I don't think we can take the leap forward that we need if we don't see development in that area from Josh Allen. I would rather invest in a guy who has skill in that area to make sure that, hey, if we got a guy who's really good at that and we still don't see advancement there, now we know it's Josh because we laid out every possible opportunity. We got him a guy who is the faster, taller, more athletic version of Duke Williams that he obviously leaned into in that playoff game. And now we know that it's actually a shortcoming on him because we laid out every opportunity, or that's the reason that you take the leap forward is he was ready to take that step and you gave him the weapon. Where do you fall in that philosophy? I don't think one's right or wrong by any means. Where do you fall in how much you maximize what we've already seen versus finding a player that might fit a needed advancement, but there's risk in wondering whether he can do it?
Well, I think maybe the most important thing I can say right off the bat is that I'm greedy and I discriminate when it comes to first round picks. I don't want there to be concessions, right? So when I think about a player, regardless of the position, is that, and I'm going to take him in the first round, I don't want guys that I look at their skill set and say, I have to make concessions because they don't do this well. So I think fundamentally, before I even apply anything to the Bills, any player that I even give a first round grade to, I want to feel like I'm not giving up anything. This is a complete player. It's regardless of scheme, they can come in and contribute. So fundamentally, I think that's important for people to know about me. And so as we apply that to T. Higgins, I agree that he would absolutely round out the Bills wide receiver core with a perfectly complementary skill set to what's already in place. Cole Beasley, John Brown, T. Higgins. You don't draw it up XYZ much better than that. To be completely honest with you. And people could hear me right now and say, well, if that's building the perfect receiving core for Josh Allen, what the hell's your problem with the pick? Right? So it comes down to, I feel like I can get those traits that T. Higgins brings in a player in the second or third round and get a more complete player in the first round. If you told me the Bills picked T. Higgins at 54, I'm going to have a party. Right? I'm going to be really happy about that. Now, when you start talking to him about him at 22, I don't want a guy that really is a vertical threat, a jump ball specialist. I want a guy that can help me at receiver with yards after catch, with separating in the intermediate areas, that can play inside and outside. Right now, I'm a little bit nervous that you have to give T. Higgins a lot of free runways and playing him in the slot because I'm not sure what his technique is like beating press coverage. He hasn't really been tested in that way going up against pretty soft defenses in the ACC. So I can get a Michael Pittman, or I can get a Brian Edwards, or I can get a Justin Jefferson, or a Denzel Mims, or a Donovan Peoples-Jones that do all of those things that T. Higgins can do later in the draft. If I'm getting a receiver in the first round, I just don't want to make concessions. So when I do start to think about the other layer of that discussion that I bring up is, I've said this before, that there are teams that I would be okay with taking T. Higgins in the first round because I do think that they would mean a lot to the offense because they're that player away. And so if you talk about like the New Orleans Saints, who Michael Thomas caught 149 balls, and then Ted Ginn, the Ohio State receiver, caught 30. I mean, that was the difference between their leading receiver in terms of wide receivers to their next guy. Go get T. Higgins for Drew Brees, right? That's going to be a difference maker in your Super Bowl window and maximizing your 42-year-old quarterback. So for me, it's just about where the Bills are, where Josh Allen is and what I value in first round picks, especially when we're talking about my team, right? I'm really going to be hard on my principles as an evaluator when it comes to applying them to my team. And that's really where I go with this discussion. I'm greedy and I discriminate against a lack of complete skill sets in the first round.
Well, and I think a healthy way to look at this, and the way I've kind of countered some of those discussions when people have talked about reaching, and who you can almost put any receiver in at 22 outside the top three, but yeah. I'm going to use T. Higgins in this example. What you have to realize is the alternative and the drop off at the other spots. We'll play a couple of matching games. Would you rather have T. Higgins and Damon Arnett, or would you rather have Jeff Gladney and Denzel Mims? Or even if it's Michael Pittman, someone that's comparable and not a great value falling to 54, but someone that's there. Would you rather have T. Higgins and Darrell Young, or would you rather have Yetur Gross-Matos and Michael Pittman? Would you rather have a value like Andrew Thomas falls or something like that and getting a guy later on in Brandon Ayuk, or would you rather have T. Higgins and reach on Ezra Cleveland or Matt Pert or whatever it might be? That just where the drop off and changes happen of where those positions are, there's such a better opportunity to go, and it doesn't have to be, but I think it makes a lot of sense that our second and our fourth round pick are receivers, and that we will end up with just as happy of a combination as if we took them in the first and third, versus the talent that you could get at the other spots, or the more complete prospect you could get combined with those other talents in a historically deep draft class. I think that it consistently comes out with a better combo by doing it in that order.
Yeah, I think anytime you can bring combinations into play, it's really important. I mean, how many times have you watched a team go through the draft, especially now that we have one round on one night, the next two on one night, and then the last four on a separate night? When you start to see the whole puzzle come together, you can really understand what the team tried to do that year. Yeah. But we have to speak in like isolation, because the picks are so choppy in terms of when they happen, because it's across 3 different nights. And so, yeah, I think when you isolate certain picks and you don't know what happened the rest of the way, you're not getting that complete picture. And so right now it's just, okay, T. Higgins in the first round, and that's all we're talking about. If you bring all those other factors into the equation, then I'm definitely going to be able to tell you what I like the most. So I just feel like the Bills will have an opportunity to get a player better than T. Higgins in the first round at a potentially different position, and get a player very similar to what T. Higgins can bring, and the reasons why people so commonly mock T. Higgins to the Bills in the first round, in the second or third round.
Yeah. No, I think it makes a lot of sense. You spoke to it on your show about a potential target of moving up, and that I do think that that's a range. You could see the tail end of that second tier of receivers start to dry up at pick 42, pick 45, pick 49, and that you see a slight move up there to be able to snag the last one of those guys. And there's a scenario where the last one of those guys could be T. Higgins, in that you want to grab that before the tier drops off. But I also think that there's a lot of other names that come out that could also make as much or more sense in that range. But people get tied to those mock drafts, and they see these so-called experts tie their name to it, and all of a sudden now it's painful where you're passing on them.
Well, can we talk about that for a second? Like accuracy in mock drafts, because it's very, very near and dear to my heart. I guess first thing, the best mock drafters in the world get 10 or 11 matches right. That's it in the first round. That's the best. You go to huddlereport.com, you'll see they score people's mock drafts and average it against 5 years. And I do pretty well. I'm in the top 10 for my 5-year average, and I won it in 2017. I had the most accurate mock draft, and I had 11 matches. That's it. That's all I got right.
Yeah, so, that was the most accurate for that year, and you went 11 for 32.
That's the best. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. It's even weirder when you get to 22, right? Like the first 10 picks, you should get 6 or 7 of those, probably 5. When you start getting further down the board, it's really difficult. And when you screw one guy up, right, then you can't make up for it, right? So you're wrong on one guy, then you really miss 2 picks, right?
Yeah.
So it's tough. But like, what was so weird is it's January, and I can't click on a mock draft with a player different than T. Higgins mocked to the Bills. Like it's not Joe Burrow at 1 to the Bengals is an absolute, and then at 22 T. Higgins to the Bills. Like I think and that really inspired me to kind of, I don't know, what am I the leader of the anti-T Higgins band? I might
you're close. You're close.
And I've at least given some reasonable ideas as to how I can get behind it. Right. I've said good things about T Higgins. Like, I don't have a problem with him as a human. Like, he seems like a good dude. I think he'll be a good player, but like, I think I've articulated both sides of the equation. I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I just want a more complete player.
It's funny. So we've been doing a fair amount of analysis on that exact same topic you brought up, in that, and plenty of people that come on, a friend of ours, Drew Gear, that does Rock Power Report, is at the forefront of all mock drafts are trash. You should not pay attention to any of them. They're just silly. That, when the best guy is 11 out of 32, what the heck is the point? And I told him, I said, I don't look at them as predictive models. Mm-hmm. I like them to build the frame of reference, and exactly the conversation we had, understanding the cost, opportunity cost alternatives of, hey, I know it sounds good to take that guy here, but really we can get that alternative next at no drop off, but there's a huge drop off here. And you don't really grasp that until you do your 10th and your 50th mock draft to realize, hey, yeah, this drops off pretty quickly. You should probably say, if you're either get one here or you don't care. So a random one, I'm like that with running backs. I want one of those top 6. And if we don't get one of the top 6, I don't care if it's a UDFA, because I don't think there's a difference maker after that drop off. But that kind of idea, you don't get that until you do those. So I think they're helpful to build the frame of reference, to build the strategy, not to be predictive. One shout out, as we were doing the research to find it, Mike over at PFF, Mike Renner. His final one was Ed Oliver at 9, Greg Little in the 2nd, and Dawson Knox in the 3rd round.
Very good.
And I was like, he got Ed Oliver falling to 9, a tackle in the 2nd round, and Dawson Knox being a 3rd round pick. It was, Devin Singletary was weaseled in there, but that one was pretty good. And beyond that, they're all hysterical. And they're just all over the board to do that. So fans shouldn't look at them as predictive models of what they're. Look at the kind of position, the kind of value, where they're seeing that, and where the needs line up, and then how much that shifts after free agency. That's where any of the value comes in. It's just understanding the kind of things that we need, the kind of players that we need. And then in hindsight, there'll be some good luck stabs that people got right, but not because somebody had some inside information. It's just when you do enough of them, a couple people will stab it right.
The goal for me, I think I've written 6 or published 6 mock drafts so far for this draft cycle. And my goal every time is to present a scenario. Yeah. And sometimes the scenario, like my last one, Greg, I had the Eagles moving up from 21 to 10 to go get Isaiah Simmons. I had the Bills moving up for Henry Ruggs. I had Tua going 3 to the Lions. I had, the goal was to say, okay, these things are not crazy ideas. Yeah. Let's do it and show you what could happen. And that's my entire objective. Now, I will say this, with my last mock draft, my goal is absolutely to be 100% accurate. And again, my real goal is to get 30% of it right. But and that is a lot of talking to people, everybody that I can talk to that will give me anything, trying to piece it together, and then you're just trying to figure out what you're supposed to believe and what you're not supposed to believe. So I will say it's all about scenarios until you see the word final mock draft, and you'll know that I've done everything I can to try to put together a true scenario. But man, I sweat through that last one. It takes me way too long to get 10 or 11 picks right.
Well, no, but it's awesome. And it's fantastic to see someone like you who can combine the years of work and effort you've put in from an evaluation standpoint, the network of resources that you've built over time to be able to get, glimmers. Nobody's giving secret tips on things of who they're going to be, but you get a little more informed, guesstimate of where they're leaning. And that if things fall a certain way, I think it's pretty likely they're going to go with this guy. It's awesome to see work like that come to fruition, where you can see that kind of payoff and be able to put out some good information, even relatively predictably, versus where some of the other stabs go. Well,
thank you. And no matter how much work you do, you can never predict that Dante Whitner is going to go in the top 10.
It's just, sometimes I am now a GIF of my own because of my reaction to Cleveland Farrell at 4.
Oh, was that? I seen the GIF a billion times. I didn't know what it was.
That's what it is. That was live. Me watching big. Wait, what? he just went fourth, and there are other surprises that are out there, but I don't know anyone who had that even in the realm of possibility that, okay, here we go. And it's just fun to be able to do this. So I can't wait for draft season. I know everybody listening here, I'm sure, listens to the Locked On Bills podcast. If you haven't, please make sure that you do. But something else, if you're not in tune, or you're maybe like me, where you do a lot of cramming at the end and you're not as in tune with the college football season, make sure you're checking out the Draft Dudes podcast. Just awesome work by Joe. I know people know him on the Bills side of things, but so much time and effort of where Joe's core knowledge and experience and subject matter expertise is on the Draft Network. Check out his write-ups on all the players, his big board, his mock drafts. Fantastic work. Always giving a little bit of insight on the Bills spin of things, but just an overall wealth of knowledge in the Draft Network. And this is your time to shine, man. It's fantastic to have someone like you in our world and being able to share that kind of insight with the overlap of your knowledge, and just appreciate you giving us some time here today.
Absolutely, Greg. It's nice to be on with you and connect with the audience over here at Cover One. So it's been fun.
Thank you very much, man. You guys have been listening to Cover One Buffalo, and we are out.